Thank you, Ubisoft. Is it Ubisoft or Ubisoft? I don't even know. But what I do know is other developers need to take note and listen to how you guys reveal system requirements, because so many games are just minimum recommended. It doesn't even say if it's for 1080p or 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second or low settings or high settings, and some developers do better than others. But now we've got Ubisoft over here doing much better. However, I do have to complain a little bit, which is, for this video, I'm gonna have to mix a couple of things. If you actually go to their store and look at the system requirements on the game, they have more limited information than they do on another news post, although that's missing some important details too. And we're gonna have to kind of put these together, and then I'll help you understand how what these settings actually are. What are these CPUs and GPUs, and how might yours fall in relation to these? So on their actual system requirements page, you're gonna see the minimum for 1080p 30 frames per second low preset, the recommended for 1440p 60 frames per second ultra preset. You'll also see the ultra 4K 30 frames per second ultra preset. What it doesn't tell you is whether these are using ray tracing or not. It also doesn't give you all the other information. Now, if we pop over to this news post that they have that came out this morning, we actually have much more information. We have whether the ray tracing is on or off, and we have other combinations of settings for 60 frames per second versus 30 at different resolutions. But this one doesn't tell you if the settings are high or low. For example, on this one, we've got 1080p 30 frames per second DirectX ray tracing off, but it doesn't tell you that that's low settings. But we can tell that it's low settings by comparing it to their page over here on their requirements page, where it does say that it's the low preset. So I'm gonna help you guys out with figuring out how this all matches up, and again, where these system requirements fall, and help you figure out what they mean for you. Anyway, so here's the good news. The minimum, hey, stop covering up my screen. Go away. Okay, there we go. The minimum that to actually just get in the gate and run the game, if you're okay with 1080p 30 frames per second, is a pretty low bar, and I love that. It's very easy to get into the game. Now, the high end, if you want to max this thing out at 4K, especially with ray tracing on, you need an absolute beast of a system. And this is just another example of a game where I'd say it'd be really nice to actually get to the next gen of GPUs, like the 4080 or something like that. But you can always tweak settings a little bit. Anyway, I'm rambling on quite a bit. Let's jump right in. So I'm gonna mostly focus on this page, this news article, which had more information for us to look at, but we'll need to compare to certain things to figure out what they actually meant by low presets or ultras and things like that. Anyway, so 1080p 30 frames per second, DirectX ray tracing off, and again, we can tell that this is the low preset by checking the other page. Annoying that we have to do that. Is CPU. The CPUs here look very modest. These are both 4-core, 4-thread CPUs. The Ryzen is a bit newer. The i5 is from way back in 2014, but this is a lower end, but newer Ryzen, and you know, this was a more mid-range, but older Intel. But basically what they're saying is the barrier to entry here is a pretty old and not that great 4-core, 4-thread, but you do want to at least be on the Ryzen line here, not something older than that. And you know, i5 4460. I don't think I need to dwell on that, but again, I do want to be clear here that a 30 frames per second target, and same thing if we talk about the 60 frames per second targets, these aren't necessarily saying that you're going to always be at 30 or 60. You could be above or below. You could definitely see dips below this. These are definitely going to be talking about averages. Also, I'll mention, some people probably already wondering, does this include DLSS or FSR? This game will support FSR, but they did announce at the bottom of this article here that these were tested with the FSR feature disabled. So you can actually get better performance than this by using FSR. If you want my thoughts on FSR, watch one of my other videos. I might link it up here. But basically at lower resolutions, it doesn't look that great, but can get you a bit more performance. At higher resolutions, like 1440p ultra quality or at 4K ultra quality, it does a very good job at getting you some frame rates back. Doesn't appear that the game will support DLSS that I've seen, but we do have ray tracing support. All right, anyway, jumping over to the 1080p 30 frames per second GPUs, and again, this is the low preset. We still have to keep that in mind. We have the RX 460 and the NVIDIA GTX 960. Please note that it's saying 4 GB here. You might be going, I have a 960, I'm good to go. You probably bought the 960 2 GB version. Sorry, at the time, that's what most people recommended. Google it, you'll see the discussion threads. These cards both launched with a 2 GB version and with a 4 GB version. And you might have the 2 GB version, and they're definitely saying it must be the 4 GB version. Okay, if you want to get an idea of where those cards fall performance-wise, this is actually a little bit interesting here. So the 960 is generally considered to be quite a bit faster than a 460. According to Tech Power up over here, which does some averages, and I could shrink myself out of the way, a 460 is usually about 75% the performance of a 960. What could explain this? Well, certain games and game engines favor NVIDIA architectures or AMD architectures, and Ubisoft titles, like, for example, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, favors AMD, and we could be seeing that again here. This could be a sign of that. Now, if you want an idea of where your GPU falls in relation to these, if these aren't one of the ones that you have, again, double check the 4 GB thing. You could come to this website or look at this here and kind of scroll and see where yours falls relative to these. So those are your just barely getting in the gate, although you could technically play at 720p or something like that, or use FSR to scale down from 1080p and come in here even lower than this. Pretty standard to recommend 8 GB at the lower end settings and 16 for the high when we're talking RAM. Remember, RAM and VRAM, not the same thing, although notice it is saying this is based on a dual channel setup. If you bought a pre-built system, sometimes they come with 8 GB, but it's in a single stick, not 2. Now that's not gonna have a huge impact on your performance, but you might see your minimum frame rates tank a bit in situations where the dual channel's hurting it, and it will hurt your overall performance a little bit as well. So anyway, they're just making a note of that. They're also recommending 60 GB of storage, and this is on Windows 10. Okay, now here's the thing. On their system requirements page, they just jump up here to 1440-60 Ultra. But check this out. On the news article, we have more information. We have 1080p 60 frames per second with ray tracing off. Now, they don't specifically say ultra settings, but I think they mean ultra settings, and here's why. Because if we look at 1440p 60 frames per second ray tracing off for the 1440p settings, this matches up to the specs on their system requirement page over here that are for 1440p 60 frames per second, and they do say that it's the ultra preset, okay? So I think when they're doing the 60 frames per second ray tracing off stuff, they mean the ultra preset in this news article, but for some reason they didn't put that here, which is, come on. You went through all this trouble to do a better job than all the other developers out there on giving us this info, and you still mess it up. So anyway, I'm assuming this is 1080p 60 frames per second, ultra settings, but with ray tracing off. They're now saying the CPUs should bump up to a Ryzen 5 3600X or an Intel i7 7700. Now, the 3600X and the 7700 are a huge step up from their low-end requirements for that 30 frames per second. So it's looking like your 4-core 4-thread might get you a 30 frames per second average, but you're gonna see a lot of dips below 60. So they're definitely recommending a big step up there. The R5 3600X, I believe, is a 6-core 12-thread CPU from around, I think it's 2019-ish. And the Intel i7 7700 is 8-core 8-thread. It doesn't have that hyper-threading, but it has more actual cores. Okay, so it's looking like we do want more cores and newer cores to get a nice stable 60 frames per second. Now, they're recommending here the GPUs as a Vega 64 8GB or a GTX 1080 8GB. So, if we pop on over to our, I had this page out, we can now scroll down and see how much more demanding that is. So if you want to go from 1080p low 30 from a GTX 960, let's scroll up to a GTX 1080 and see where that puts us. Let's also see what other GPUs would be nearby so you can see if it's yours, for example. So if we go up to a 1080, we're seeing like a 2.7 times increase in terms of the demand here to both. Now this makes sense because you would want a 200% increase to go from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second. And then you would also want more to jump from low settings to high settings. So I would imagine, by the way, that this means that if you just wanted 1080p 60 frames per second low settings, you'd probably be good here around a 200% increase, which would put you at something in this ballpark. Okay, so if we're jumping up again to 200%, so that puts you, so like if you have a 1660 Super, for example, or actually 1660 is a great example. So like a 1660 would probably be great for 60 frames per second low settings. And then if you want to bump up to ultra settings, that's where you want to jump up to something more like the GTX 1080. And that's what that extra 73% on top of that 1660 gets you, is going from low to ultra. So that's how I would read this and infer a little bit more about the different settings that they didn't tell us. So hopefully that was useful to you and you find yours here somewhere on this list. There's a lot of settings to get through here, so I don't want to dwell on it. You can also mention in the comment section. Other people can probably help you make some of these, decide how your system stacks up in the comment section. All right, so over here now we I think should jump up to, I mean, they did say 16 gigabytes of RAM, and now they're starting to recommend an SSD. If we're although they recommended that even for the 30 frames per second here. So SSD is recommended. Although again, they don't actually say that on their actual system requirement page on their store, which is frustrating. But SSD is recommended. 16 gigabytes of RAM recommended for the 60 frames per second Ultra. All right, 1440p, 16 frames per second, ray tracing off. Again, it doesn't say it, but I think this is at ultra settings, because if you jump over to, if you look at these specs and then go to their store page, the store page has these same specs here, and it does say it's ultra preset, although it didn't tell you if ray tracing was on or off. Why do I have to look at both pages to do it? Come on, Ubisoft, you were so close to doing this right. Now anyway, so we're seeing these same, well actually not quite the same. So they're jumping up to a 9700 instead of a 7700 here on the CPU from the Intel side, while they're leaving the Ryzen 5 3600X. Now I'm going to be honest, I find this a little bit weird. Was the 7700 8-core? I might need to actually double check on that, guys. My bad. But anyway, I know that the 9700 is 8-core. I actually thought that was a 9700 when I saw it a second ago. 9700 is definitely 8-core. Maybe that one's not. Now they're definitely recommending the 8-core here, and this is newer. I think this is a 2019 chip. It's a little better than mine. I have a 9600K. Anyway, I think it's odd that they're bumping up the CPU requirements here. I think they're just doing that as you go up. They're just going to bump up the CPUs too, because honestly, if you could get 60 frames per second at 1080p on that CPU, you can probably get 60 frames per second at 1440p and at 4K. Usually it's not going to be the CPU that's getting a lot of more increase on its demand as you bump up the resolution and the graphic settings. It's going to be the GPU. So that's my thoughts on that. If you're fine with this here, you're probably also fine here, but obviously better, and maybe your mins will be better on more demanding areas. All right, the RX 5700 XT and the 2070 Super is our recommendation here. Now, these are strong GPUs, and let's actually pop over here. I believe I pulled up a Tech Power Up page here. So the 2070 Super is usually considered to be on average a bit faster than the 5700 XT, although it depends on the game. So once again, if this is an AMD engine favoring title, then that could be why the 5700 XT is stacked up here, although they are pretty close in general. Now, these are way faster than the ones we were looking at for like the 1080p 30 frames per second low. If we want to compare it to like the GTX 1080 that was recommended for the 1080p stuff, that's at like 78% of the 2070 Super. All right, so it gets you an idea of where your GPU might fall for these settings. Again, this is ray tracing off, but at ultra settings, 1440p 60. That's where a lot of people are at right now. Notice these are 8 gigabyte GPUs that's recommending for this. All right, jumping up to 1440p 60 frames per second with ray tracing on. I would imagine all other settings still at at ultra. Again, they're bumping up the CPUs again. which just doesn't, turning on ray tracing increases the demand on your GPU. It should not be increasing the demand on your CPU. So yeah, these are better CPUs, but I'm once again gonna say, if you're getting 60 frames per second here, you should still be getting 60 frames per second here. So I wouldn't sweat that too badly if you're not actually on meeting these ones, but they're just bumping up those requirements. But look at these GPUs. So we know that NVIDIA does ray tracing better than AMD. That's one of their big advantages, that and DLSS, although this game has FSR, which is cool. So the 3070 is being stacked up against the 6900 XT, and that does make sense because this is with ray tracing on, okay? Now, I have a 6800 XT, so it's looking like for me to do this game with ray tracing, I think 1440p and then with some FSR at ultra quality would probably get me there. Now, these GPUs, let's see how much, what kind of step up is this? So we went from a 2070 Super, but if we want to turn on ray tracing, we're now wanting to jump up to a 3070. Which is like a 35% jump in performance there, and you can look at these other cards, but remember that this isn't stacking up in terms of ray tracing performance, which is why they went all the way up to a 6900 XT, which without ray tracing is gonna be smashing a 3070. But with ray tracing, that's why it's bringing those in line, okay? Now, we're still on the 16 gigabytes of RAM. Now notice they're saying now that if you want HD textures, you can download an HD texture pack for another 37 gigabytes. Now for me, textures are gonna look great at higher resolution, so I'm gonna do that. Now, 4K 30 frames per second, ray tracing on, here we go. My PC isn't ready. Your probably isn't either, because honestly, do we really want to be playing at 30 frames per second? Look at this, guys. So first of all, I'm gonna say they again bumped up the CPU, but we're playing at 30 frames per second here. Ubisoft, this is nonsense. If you're playing the game at 30 frames per second, you don't need a 5800X CPU. Okay, bumping up the resolution is mostly going to bump up the GPU demand. But anyway, they put these here. Those are great CPUs. Good job on you if you have one. I don't think you really need this for 30 frames per second at 4K. Anyway, so ray tracing on, and now I'm baffled because they were stacking a 6900 XT up against a 3070. But now they're putting a 6800 up against a 3080. That's not even a 6800 XT, but they are saying ray tracing on here. And what's weird is that at 1440p, AMD cards from the 6000 series are usually scaling better relative to their 30 series NVIDIA counterparts at 1440p than they do at 4K. So, what? Kind of baffling to me. Now we can again take a peek at this over on our chart. So they're now putting the 6800, not the XT, but the 6800. I have an alarm ringing. I'm just gonna keep the video recording and I'm not editing this. We're shooting this live, guys. I'm a teacher. I don't have a lot of time to make these videos. The school year just started. We're just rolling. Anyway, 6800 up against the 3080, which again, usually is just weaker. Like, let's stack up to the 3080 here. 6800 usually is weaker, except for certain games that favor AMD. But with ray tracing on it, should be getting smashed. So did they just forget to put the XT on there? But why'd they put the 6900? Can you guys explain this one to me in the comments? Maybe I need your help. Or is Ubisoft like crazy? Anyway, so that's a bit weird, but there you go. And that's for 30, look, the 3080 at least makes sense, but that's 30 frames per second, guys. Once again, I'll remind you, this does support FSR. So it's looking like if you want ray tracing on, especially at 4K, you're gonna need a heck of a GPU. And at 4K, you're just gonna need to turn on FSR. You're gonna need FSR. The good news is that at 4K, FSR ultra quality does look great. And even stepping down to quality at 4K still usually looks really good. Whereas at the lower resolutions, I'd probably stick to ultra quality like for 1440p. Okay, what do you guys think about all of this? I really like that they gave us all this info. In addition, just since you're here, it looks like they're definitely supporting widescreen. I think by widescreen they mean like ultra wides and even super ultra wides and multi monitors. And it looks like they're definitely taking their time to have a lot of great PC-centric features. All right, I just want to give a huge thank you to people who hit the join button financially supporting me. We've got Afro here, Afro. Not sure how to pronounce your name, but thank you. You're my latest channel join person, and I hope everyone watching this video has an excellent day.